tool that we built is a spreadsheet tool. And I will start by knowing its primary focus is to compare ownership of clean energy resources. And we've largely focused here for simplicity on the near-term opportunity to own resources like wind, solar, and storage as the examples of relevance here. And we're comparing that ownership to what might be possible in terms of costs with a power purchase agreement. The tool is meant to be customizable. You'll see in the tool that every box in green is one where the input is something that you can change to look at a particular set of asset or portfolio of clean energy assets. And I should note that we've also incorporated for ease at least some information as we were able to gather from a recent co-op financial filings, some very basic information about cooperative cost of debt and cost of equity and equity ratios into the model. So the first selection that you can make is indeed to select your utility. We're just selecting the first utility on this list. Next, we would select a base year, which we take to be this calendar year, and a build year, the year that we assume that the assets that are being assessed are going to be built. In addition, the model incorporates the ability to incorporate NREL's forward-looking expected clean energy cost trajectory. And one can choose to use NREL's moderate, advanced, or conservative cost assumptions. And make a choice as to the life of the clean asset that is being modeled. Note that also below, we have the ability and the flexibility, and I'll talk a little bit more about this a little later, to put in manual overrides if you already have certain asset costs that have been quoted to you or that you are currently considering. These overrides can be placed in the solar, wind, and battery metric sections, and you can choose to instead use the overrides. And indeed, in the current version of the model, I have chosen to override and use some manually entered amounts. Note further that all of these amounts that are entered here, as well as the data that's displayed, are intended to be nominal dollars in the year of installation or build. So these are in 2026 dollars in the current example. And so if you're to enter them in, please make sure to enter them in expected future dollars rather than in real dollars. So with that, we also allow for flexibility to use different macroeconomic metrics that are relevant for calculations for the calculations that are done. In particular, you are either able to choose the current utility rate of return as a discount rate, or just choose 7% as a potential discount rate for discounting all calculations for the purposes of assessing cost. Finally, there are some technical parameters here. We do include some parameters based on recent market conditions that set long-run and near-term inflation assumptions. Note that we do use historical inflation assumptions, and I should have noted about the NREL costs, that those NREL costs are indeed adjusted for the recent significantly high inflation that we've experienced over the last couple of years. And so that has been incorporated, and that the NREL costs that are being used are from 2020, their most recent 2023 update of their ATB assessment of expected forward-looking costs. Finally, the other inputs, we have here several different inputs in terms of the weighted, the cost of equity, the cost of debt, and the equity ratio. And the most important input assumption here, one that's really critical for the functioning of this model and is important to really assess the economics of the choice between a PPA and ownership, is really around the balance sheet challenges of ownership. And to reflect this, we have incorporated here a target equity ratio. That is, We understand that a lot of cooperatives may face challenges in achieving the equity ratio that they need to maintain in order to avoid any kind of credit ratings impacts. And here we allow you to set a target for any potential ownership option of the equity ratio that you'd like to maintain to mitigate that impact. Now, why do we do that within this model? It's because this model also allows you to make selections about the choice of the New Era, of the use of the New Era program. If the New Era program is used in grant form, that New Era program grant can play the role of providing some of the equity that meets that 25% target, as can the choice of an investment tax credit through via direct pay for assets that are ITC eligible, in particular assets like storage, which are only eligible for the investment tax credit, but also solar and wind, where the investment tax credit may be attractive. Next, we do incorporate the possibility, we've mentioned stranded assets as another challenge, of using the New Era program to refinance the costs associated with the unrecovered costs associated with an older asset that you might want to replace or factor down using the New Era program, and allows you to incorporate that unrecovered balance and any remaining life of that asset into the lending. You're able to set the tenor of the loan. We've assumed 30 years, but the maximum is 35 years under statute for USDA. And I should also note that there's a technical issue here that we've also allowed you to set, which is once you get, for example, a USDA New Era grant, let's suppose that you as a utility were able to get $100 million, you have a choices to make as to how you return that $100 million in benefit to your customers, to your member owners, in terms of the impact that that grant may have on reduced rates. You may choose to return that voluntarily over some period of time that may not be the full life of the assets that you may be building with some of the funding from the program. You may instead choose to return it more rapidly to provide benefits upfront to your customers. And so choosing voluntary normalization allows you to set a number of years, the normalization period, that you may choose to return that benefit to your customers. We assume that for that same normalization period would apply for how you would, whether or not you choose to use the USDA New Era grant for reducing the cost of owned or purchased power. Finally, we do allow as well for you to allocate, if you choose to just look at the potential use of just a portion of your USDA award from New Era for the particular asset that you may be looking at, we allow you to reduce the amount of the available potential total grant that you're going to be considering to allow you to look at a piece of the portfolio, or rather, if you'd like to model the entire portfolio, you can set this at 100% or reduce that to use a smaller percentage of the grant. Next, there is a technical issue that I wanted to flag, which is that the New Era grant can be split into a couple of different types of support. The New Era grant can be, or the New Era funding can be split into several different types of financial support. That financial support can include a grant, but it can also include lending from New Era at different interest rates. And there is a limit to the amount of total financial support that New Era can provide any given utility. That limit is $970 million for any given utility. And if it is used to offset the costs of assets, it can only be used to offset up to 25% of those costs. So these two limitations are important. Now, if it is used to request financing, that also has an impact on the cost, but the total volume of that financing does not translate into a directly into that $970 million. Instead, USDA has published what are called credit subsidy costs, conversion factors that tell you what fraction of a loan counts against that $970 million if you choose to ask for a loan. And so those credit subsidy costs are incorporated into this model. And depending on the type of loan that you choose, whether you choose a 2% loan, a 0% loan, or a treasury rate loan, that credit subsidy cost can differ. Now, there is some still controversy around the particular choice that USDA is making for how that loan volume translates into this some portion of the $970 million, in particular for treasury rate loans. If you click yes here, the treasury rate loans will appear, according to the most recent Q&A, to be quite expensive, as they are considered to be just as expensive as the 2% spread loans. So, but that's our default, that we'll use the Q&A. And here, what you would, in order to choose a 0 or 2% loan, you should set 0 in the spread over treasuries and then choose either 0 or 2% as the spread here. Now, as I said below, this is a good time to go and look back at the assets themselves. You're able to make some choices about the asset that you include here. You can make some choices about whether you are using the NREL data here for solar, wind, and battery metrics. The metrics are largely the same. So I'll talk about solar, which is quite general. You can incorporate a particular class of NREL solar class, if you happen to know the solar class, to get to a capacity factor, or you can directly input a solar CapEx, OpEx, and capacity factor. Now, one additional factor that we consider is that there is more risk in ownership of a solar, wind, or battery asset. One way to offset that cost is to get what is called a full wrap O&M contract to reduce that risk of operations and maintenance costs. And we assume that there may be a discount if you choose to use a PPA rather than to bear that risk yourself. And this percentage is effectively a way to enter in the cost differential between ownership and a PPA associated with bearing that additional risk. So, for example, putting in 10% here means that the operations and maintenance costs for a PPA are assumed to be 10% lower because the developer is assumed to have that capability and is able to take that and bear that risk more without having to pay additionally for someone else to bear that risk. So this is a place to enter that in. Very importantly, it's important to enter in the total capacity that you intend to deploy, as well as expected solar degradation. Finally, there are adders to the tax credits that are tied to whether or not the project is, or any individual project is able to achieve the domestic content requirements and whether the project is sited in an energy community. And you can put in the percentage of the perhaps a number of different individual sites that may total to this solar, this 1 gigawatt in solar capacity. You can incorporate a percentage of them that you anticipate being able to get the 10% adder for domestic content and the 10% adder to energy communities. The final and important choice that you can make is whether you choose for solar and wind to use the production tax credit versus the investment tax credit. One of the key features of this model is it allows you to consider both the balance sheet impacts and the net present value cost impacts of making those choices. The choice of an investment tax credit may be easier on your balance sheet because the investment tax credit through direct pay creates additional equity on your balance sheet. But the choice of the production tax credit does not have that extra equity benefit, but has a much greater net present value for most solar and wind resources across the country, as the PTC tends to be, on a net present value basis, more lucrative for your customers. It will reduce costs for your customers better than an ITC would. Note that this choice is not available for the battery, which will only have an ITC. On the other hand, the choice of incorporating storage into a new era proposal has a kind of a side benefit to your balance sheet in that it requires the use of the investment tax credit, could be cited in a retired asset, and therefore it take advantage of an energy community benefit, energy communities adder, and very often again, to the extent to which there is domestic battery manufacturing capability that can be deployed, might also have the domestic content adder. So a battery can be a powerful way, because of the incentives and adders, to reuse your existing fossil sites potentially, and to build your balance sheet health by bringing in what is effectively significant additional equity in the form of the investment tax credit with the domestic content and energy community adders. So with these choices and the total number of gigawatts, and again, there's also a choice to look at 4 or different types of battery storage levels as well, I should note. You can then come back up to the top, and with that, there is some total required financing that is now calculated in cell C43. And the question is, well, how are you going to make that work? Well, you've chosen some loan size that you're hoping to get from New Era, and there is some amount of grant that is allowed. And now what you do is hit the calculate loan size button, and it helps you figure out what loan you need in addition to the investment tax credit and the New Era grant to actually finance the entire asset. Now, there's a couple of checks on that. You will note these 2 cells, C52 and 53. If you make a choice, for example, that you choose PTC, and let's suppose, for example, that I'm also building some wind here, and I want that to be PTC wind, then I might find that I don't have enough funding to make this work. And so when I calculate loan size, it may help me figure out whether I can make that work. Now, if I wanted to build even more PTC assets, I may eventually run up against a situation where I can't actually make this work with PTC assets. And so if I increase the number of PTC solar assets to 2 gigawatts, and now try to calculate, well, I need 5.2 billion for that. If I try to calculate the loan size that I need to get lending from New Era and to build a grant, what I'll find here is that I need additional membership equity to hit my 25% metric. And this is not necessarily particularly attractive. So there are cases where these parameters will need to be adjusted in order for the project to work well. For now, I'm going to return it to a situation where this is a viable opportunity. And what you'll find is that in this case, the project is in fact viable. I could indeed get a loan from New Era and make it work within the envelope of the amount of funding that I have. And here is the 2 really important takeaways from here. There is a net present value of benefit that I'm getting from the use of the New Era program that allows me to add, that basically is allowing me to achieve a certain equity ratio to use the PTC rather than the ITC, and gives me additional value. And that's broken down here. And it also gives me financing cost savings relative to what I could achieve from the market, from financing from CoBank or other market resources. This section here tells me the total capital structure that I've achieved. And here you'll see that you achieved you only required a 50% leverage, and you actually you actually were able to bring in more equity than you might have otherwise needed. And then the final bottom line is, in this particular situation, given this particular resource portfolio, there is a very significant benefit from potential ownership of this asset using the New Era and ITC and PTC relative to what the calculated PPA price might be using the New Era grant instead to offset PPA costs. What we find here is that the New Era financing as a package is much more cost effective than the use of a PPA. And that's the bottom line as we think about, that bottom line will shift depending on the particular portfolio. But we generally are finding that in this case, ownership really does make a lot of sense for a lot of cooperatives, depending in many, many different circumstances, particularly when coupled with the value being provided by the New Era program, and that you can maximize the value of the New Era program in particular by taking advantage of the grants taking advantage of the possibility of ownership in particular relative to purchasing the same portfolio of assets through a PPA. Now we can always we can change these parameters to look at different combinations of assets and compare these different circumstances or different portfolios of assets under different circumstances. For example, you may not choose to allocate. You may have other projects that you want to look at, and you may only want to look at applying about 50% of the grant of your USDA grant or financing for financing this particular asset. So if you do that, you may have less ability to really take advantage of the New Era grant, and your loan size may need to be recalculated. In this case, there is still an advantage, but your leverage ratio has changed. You need to get more of a loan than you're able to get than just the grant alone. And the trade-off between a PPA and a grant and the New Era financing will change. And of course, the New Era financed owned asset is going to become more expensive if you're using and willing to use less of the New Era grant for this purpose. So these are the types of calculations that the tool is able to help facilitate. And it helps, we hope that it can be helpful to you as you compare different resources and their potential values, or different resources that you might want to deploy and the potential value of ownership of those resources relative to purchasing that power with support from the New Era program. We also wanted to note that even beyond the New Era program, even if the New Era program, if, for example, you are interested in asking the same question without the New Era program, you can always set the New Era grant to 0 and ask whether what the value of the use of the ITC and PTC is relative to third-party ownership, and compare that even in the absence of the New Era grant in this tool. With that, we are happy. I know that the tool is somewhat complex, but we're very happy to engage with you on a one-on-one basis through the end of this LOI process, as well as through the application process, to help you use this tool. We're happy to help you walk through how to use this tool, and to also work with you to modify the tool as needed to achieve to address the specific questions and needs that you might have. And we're looking forward to hearing from you about how we can make the tool more useful to you. With that, I think we've reached the end of the presentation of the tool, and we'd invite you, as we mentioned, to visit this website and click on the tool to download and take a look yourself. Thank you so much again.
Today we have the 3 clarifying questions for you about the tool to review. The first is the tool looks at opportunities to get financing from New Era and elective pay. Does it also have considerations for cooperatives that might be financing new assets with other sources of capital, for example, through traditional lenders?
In principle, the tool does have the flexibility to allow you to specify the loan financing that you will be getting by specifying a specific spread over treasuries. And so indeed, if you do want to look at the ITC and make the choice to look at lending from another source, the tool is indeed flexible enough to allow you to look at that circumstance as well. In the case where you choose not to use the USDA program specifically. And in that case, you would likely hit no for using the USDA credit subsidy costs from the Q&A and look at a particular spread over treasuries to achieve that outcome.
Thank you. A second question gets at the timing of some of these Inflation Reduction Act program dispersals. And in particular, it gets at a concern related to the need for bridge financing in some cases. How can cooperatives that are thinking through how to fund projects where they're relying on taking in a tax credit assess some of the risks or possibilities for providing bridge financing using this tool?
So this tool doesn't directly attack the question of bridge financing, though it does indirectly account for the fact that the expected payments or the expected um, impact of the ITC is likely delayed through normalization. So there are ways that the model can provide some insight into the impact of bridge financing. But our expectation is the fact that USDA does have that option is going to be important for making the use of new era lending for ownership even more reasonably attractive as well. On balance, we think that's on the order of a few percent effect. And what we're seeing here is that the ownership is often much more is quite a bit more lucrative than that relative to the PPA. So we haven't directly addressed that here, but only indirectly.
And then finally, so the tool right now addresses the New Era program as well as elective pay tax credits. There are a number of other federal programs through the Inflation Reduction Act or the Infrastructure and Jobs Act that cooperatives may be considering or looking at, including DOE financing. I think the question is related to the fact that these are not currently within the tool, but are there plans or ways to assess options for making use of other federal programs as part of this thinking?
Yeah, we're happy to work with you to incorporate that thinking. For example, you can indeed, if you were to want to model the use of the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program, you can set the spread to 375 basis or 37.5 basis points and look at treasuries and change the USDA, the approach for accounting for credit subsidy costs, and at least start to do a rough assessment of the potential benefit of the EIR program rather than the USDA program that way. Now, it's not quite right. There are some, the USDA grant, for example, calculation would not quite be operating in the right way if we were to make that change, but it gives you a reasonable, it's a small error, and it would help you understand the value of the program. And we're indeed happy to work with you to make that kind of flexibility, to build that flexibility into the model.
Perfect. Well, I think that covers our technical questions. Thank you, Uday. And for folks who are watching this recording, please feel free to reach out directly for support using the tool or to ask any clarifying questions you have about its use.
Thank you all so much.